Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is February 14th, 2025, Friday, February 14th, 2025, St. Valentine's Day. And for the lovers of especially weird stuff, we have some interesting stories. All right. The first one is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and it's titled The Mysterious Mute Ladies. In the 18th century Venice, the ultimate tool of seduction for women was a plain mask covered in black velvet. She held it in place with her teeth that bit down on a button, thus making her mute, and her silence deepened the mystery of who she was and what lay behind the mask. The Venetian Moretta Muta mask was the ultimate seduction affectation used by the ladies of the city. The heads of the family, this is a quote from a writer of that times. The heads of the family and the husbands led the wives and the sons to the piazza, where I imagine they're talking about a woman had her face covered by a black moretta, which created such contrast to the whiteness of the flesh that it shone, making it highly visible. Presently, women's cosmetics is a multi-billion-dollar industry, so the thought of covering your face may appear to fly in the face of logic if you wanted to attract men. Venetian women, though, used a mask that did exactly that, exposing their upper bodies, including tinging their nipples with red carmine, so that they would be more visible behind a thin gauzy fabric that covered them. The seduction was in what was not seen. These plain black masks were called moreta muta masks. The term derives from the adjective moro, which means dark. Since the lady was holding it in place by biting down on a button on the inside, she was incapable of speaking unless she removed it, and the chase was over. At times referred to as serveta muta, which translates to mute servant. The challenge for the man was to convince her to discard her anonymity and not only see her face, but hear her voice. In truth, he did not know what lay behind the mask, so there also lay the allure of an additional risk that the final disclosure would end in disappointment. The face was considered the window to the soul, but what use was a beautiful body if there was not a passionate temperament to go with it? During the time when masks were permitted in Venice, the Moretta mask was used on a daily basis up to 6 months out of the year if the lady so desired it. Giovanni Grevenbach, who penned wonderful descriptions of Venetian costumes, wrote this in the 18th century, which is what we referred to earlier. During the 17th century, women in Paris would cover their faces with hats when they went out in public to shield their skin from the sun. A mask, like the Moretta, was an alternative to keep their skin pale, which was very fashionable. Masks also helped different Venetian social classes to blend, especially after the introduction of theaters and gambling halls. Aristocrats and those of the lower social classes could rub elbows behind the anonymity of the masks. At this time, there was a strict social hierarchy in Venice. In 7th century France, upper class women did not go walking in public alone, but prostitutes did. The mask helped create anonymity for a woman who was unaccompanied and did not want to be considered a whore and be charged with immodesty. Like sunglasses, the mask created a type of psychic distance. In the book Venice Incognito Masks in the Serene Republic, it's noted that, starting in the late 17th century, Venetians wore masks in public for 6 months of the year, a practice they continued until the Republic's fall in 1797. The mask allowed the wearer to act on impulse and without inhibition. Venice during this time prized secrecy. A well-known figure of the city and time period was Giacomo Casanova, who adopted not only the deceit of a mask, he expanded it to travel under assumed names and personages, in which he would change his wardrobe to suit his chosen character. At the time of his life when he was known as a Chevalier de Saint-Gall, no one would suspect he was the son of a minor actress. In Venice, it wasn't only during Carnival that masks were donned. Nobles, clergy, impostors, seducers, conmen could be found mixing at every level of Venetian society. Even a pious nun donned a mask and male attire for her liaison with the libertine Casanova. During the Venice Carnival in 1754, Casanova was involved in an affair with a nun with the initials of M.M., who lived in a convent on Murano and dressed himself as Pierrot. He was also romancing C.C., a 14-year-old sent to the convent by her father. A mask enabled her to accompany him to the city, the opera, and to gambling halls. M.M. at times would steal out not only masked but dressed as a man. The carnival reached its height on what is present day known as Fat Tuesday, or the day before the start of Lent. Assignations would be postponed, and the repentant would attend Mass on Ash Wednesday, before enduring 40 days of good behavior at the peril of their souls. So, yes, it was a way to get away with it because of the strict social hierarchy. If nobody really knew who you were, they didn't know if you were highborn, lowborn. Besides the seduction aspect of it, and theaters and gambling halls, you didn't know who was who, so you could get away with a lot of things. Very interesting. Very interesting what you could get away with behind the masks. And I know at one point they were outlawed because a lot of people got away with a lot of things, of course, using that mask. All right, next story is also out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and it's titled The Mystery of the Opera Phantom. The writer Gaston Leroux appears to have been inspired by several events that occurred during his lifetime when he wrote the dark Gothic story The Phantom of the Opera, which appeared in 1910. The Paris Opera was commissioned by Emperor Napoleon III in 1861. In order to start building, the land was cleared, but workers were unable to commence as a steady stream of water would bubble up. In 1874, Le Palais Garnier was completed with rumors of a vast fish-filled lake that was said to exist underneath the opera house, which was fed by an underground river called Grange Batelier. According to the Palais Garnier Museum and Library, the lake is only a huge stone water tank created by the construction workers in order to stop the rising water and stabilize the building. It is indeed full of white catfish which are fed by the staff and is presently used by the Parisian Police Department for underwater training. The story, which was the nexus of the phantom character, was an event that took place in May 1873. The opera house in the Rue Le Pelletier caught fire and was burned to the ground. It had been there since 1821, and this was the third time the opera house had been lost to fire. The only death was a fireman who fell into the flames. But an urban myth grew out of the tragedy, where it was told that a pianist named Ernest was disfigured and his fiancée, a ballerina, died in the fire. After this event, he supposedly started living underground in the shadowing layers of l'Opéra Garnier. There were other tragic events that took place, which Leroux wove into his storyline. On May 21, 1896, a concierge who visited the opera house was killed by a chandelier counterweight which fell on her head. Another tragedy took place in May 1897 when there was a fire at a charity bazaar on the Rue Jean Goujon, where over 100 were burned to death, and many others injured. Many of the victims were aristocratic ladies who had organized the charity event. The character of Christine Daae appeared to be inspired by Christine Nilsson, a Swedish soprano whose own personal life dovetailed the events of the fictional Christine. She was famous for her performances in the operas Hamlet and Faust. Christina Nilsson, Countess de Casamiranda, was a Swedish soprano who enjoyed a 20-year career until 1888 when she retired. She was born Christina Jonasdotter, the youngest of 7 children born to Jonas Nilsson, a poor peasant. She was discovered at age 14 when she was performing at a market, and a judge became her patron, which allowed her to take vocal training. She eventually went to Paris for further instruction and would go on to tour across Europe and the United States. In 1872, she married Auguste Rouzard, a French banker. The groom's family boycotted the wedding held at Westminster Abbey in London. Christina became a widow in 1882 when her husband became ill and died at the age of 45. 5 years later, she married Don Ángel Ramón María Vallejo y Miranda, Count de Casa Miranda. They have been involved in a relationship since the death of her first husband. Nilsson is also mentioned in two major literary works, Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence and Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. There was also an apocryphal tale concerning the use of a former ballet pupil's skeleton in an 1841 production of Carl Maria von Weber's Der Frischutz. I don't know. Underneath the opera house, there are passageways that possibly stretch out to other cellars in Paris, and no doubt Leroux was also inspired by Victor Hugo's Hunchback of Notre-Dame. In that story, the disfigured Quasimodo has fallen in love with the gypsy girl Esmeralda. This story also shares a Beauty and the Beast theme. Another event that he blended into his story was when the gramophone company sealed 24 recordings of the greatest opera singers in a vault in the cellars underneath the Paris Opera in 1907. According to Leroux, the body of a disfigured architect named Eric was unearthed during the process. While this story is suspect as being true, it seems that bodies were found during the time he was writing The Phantom of the Opera, which were thought to be victims of the Commune, which were held prisoner in the cellars of the Palais Garnier. The recordings were opened in 2007 as it was intended, and the recordings were digitized. In the prologue of The Phantom of the Opera, Leroux wrote that the ghost was not a jilted older woman as many claimed, or an invention of heightened imagination or superstition of the managers. According to him, 30 years previously, there had been two brothers in love with the same woman. The two had fought, and the older brother had died, and it was his ghost which haunted the cellars of the opera house. In explanation, he wrote the following quote, Sir, I cannot urge you too strongly to publish the results of your inquiry. I remember perfectly that a few weeks before the disappearance of that great singer, Christine Daae, and the tragedy which threw the whole of the Faubourg Saint-Germain into mourning, there was a great deal of talk in the foyer of the ballet on the subject of the ghost, and I believe that it only ceased to be discussed in consequence of the later affair that excited us all so greatly. But if it be possible, as after hearing you I believe, to explain the tragedy through the ghost, then I beg you, sir, to talk to us about the ghost again. Mysterious though the ghost may at first appear, he will always be more easily explained than the dismal story in which malevolent people have tried to picture two brothers killing each other who had worshipped each other all their lives. Believe me. Lastly, with my bundle of papers in hand, I once more went over the ghost's vast domain, the huge building which he had made his kingdom. All that my eyes saw, all that my mind perceived, corroborated the Persian's documents precisely, and a wonderful discovery crowned my labors in a very definite fashion. It will be remembered that later, when digging in the substructure of the opera, before burying the phonographic records of the artist's voice, the workmen laid bare a corpse. Well, I was at once able to prove that this corpse was that of the opera ghost. I made the acting manager put this proof to the test with his own hand, and it is now a matter of supreme indifference to me if the papers pretend that the body was that of a victim of the Commune. The wretches who were massacred under the Commune in the cellars of the opera were not buried on this side, so I will tell where the skeletons can be found in a spot not very far from that immense crypt which was stocked during the siege with all sorts of provisions. I came upon this tract just when I was looking for the remains of the opera ghost, which I should never have discovered but for the unheard of chance described above. But we will return to the corpse and what ought to be done with it. For the present I must conclude this very necessary introduction by thanking Monsieur Meffrod, who was the commissary of police called in for the first investigations after the disappearance of Christine Daae. Monsieur Remy, the late secretary, Monsieur Mercier, the late acting manager, Monsieur Gabriel, the late chorus master, and more particularly Madame la Baronne de Castellat Barbezac, who was once the little Meg of the story, and who is not ashamed of it, the most charming star of our admirable corps de ballet, the eldest daughter of the worthy Madame Giry, now deceased, who had charge of the ghost's private box. All these were the greatest assistance to me, and thanks to them, I shall be able to reproduce those hours of sheer love and terror in their smallest detail before the reader's eyes. And I should be ungrateful indeed if I omitted, while standing on the threshold of this dreadful and voracious story, to thank the present management, the opera, which has so kindly assisted me in all my inquiries, and Monsieur Messager, in particular, together with Monsieur Gabillon, the acting manager, and that most amiable of men, the architect entrusted with the preservation of the building, who did not hesitate to lend me the work of Charles Garnier, although he was almost sure that I should never return them to him. Lastly, I must pay a public tribute to the generosity of my friend and former collaborator M.J. Lacrosse, who allowed me to dip into his splendid theatrical library and to borrow the rarest editions of books by which he set great store, signed Gaston Leroux. In 1925, The Phantom of the Opera was released as a silent horror film adaptation of Leroux's novel. Lon Chaney played the title role of the Phantom, and the film became famous for Chaney's horrible self-devised makeup, which was kept a studio secret until the film's premiere. He had been afforded this liberty to create his own makeup due to his success in the film The Hunchback of Notre-Dame. Chaney's makeup was the closest to the depiction of the novel, in which the Phantom is described as having a skull-like face, with a few wisps of black hair on top of his head. Like the story, he was born with these deformities, and had not been disfigured by fire or acid. The Phantom of the Opera was the longest-running show in Broadway history, and celebrated its 10,000th performance in February 2012, becoming the first Broadway production in history to do so. That the Paris Opera is haunted, most probably, but not by a disfigured genius, but possibly by more than one ghost of one of the thousands that lived, loved, and suffered inside the walls of the opera house. Even a dressmaker could have suffered from a broken love affair. No doubt there were ballerinas or chorus girls who had their hopes dashed in their attempts to reach fame. Were there any janitors who looked with longing eyes to a beautiful singer who was unaware of his existence? All of these human dramas are the fodder of earthbound spirits that seek redemption, love, or forgiveness within the place where they experience the most poignant moments of their lives. So yes, the Phantom of the Opera, what Leroux did was he took and he wove this great story using what was happening at that moment, in his time. And yes, there was supposedly the rumors of the opera ghost. But then when they start to dig it up, because they're going to make the new opera, they find these bodies that I guess have been buried there from the time of the Commune. And anyway, he just wove all these different sources and he made up a great story. He made up a great story, which I myself I went to see the Phantom of the Opera. It's a great play. It's excellent, very very nice, and the musical score with Andrew Lloyd Webber. That's absolutely wonderful. Okay, next story, titled "The Phantoms of Notre-Dame Cathedral." Since we're in France, let's stay in France. Notre-Dame Cathedral has several ghost stories associated with it, which is no surprise since no doubt skullduggery has been afoot within this ancient building for over 800 years. Notre-Dame de Paris, which translates to Our Lady of Paris, is a French Gothic Catholic cathedral which was consecrated to the Virgin Mary. Construction started in 1160 and was completed 100 years later in 1260. Its iconic towers and terrifying gargoyles that decorates its heights are recognized the world over. The ancient walls have witnessed human drama of an unknown number of anonymous persons and the coronation of kings, queens, and emperors. It was desecrated during the French Revolution when imagery and statues were destroyed. In 1844, a 20-year restoration project was started after Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre-Dame was published in 1831. On April 15, 2019, amidst an existing renovation project, a fire engulfed the cathedral and horrified Parisians witnessed as the church spires caved in and plumes of smoke filled the sky. The first stories of otherworldly events date back to the 12th and 13th century. The story goes that a locksmith engaged to work on the cathedral while it was under construction, made a pact with the devil, and then in the 13th century a blacksmith named Biscornet made the same mistake. Biscornet's metalwork was so beautiful and intricate that, along with admiration for the craftsmanship, were whispers that he only produced such flawless work after selling his soul to the devil. Like all cautionary tales, it ends badly for humans who strike a deal with Satan. The locksmith met an untimely death shortly after finishing his work, and Biscornet's creation refused to open until they were sprinkled with holy water. Even Biscornet's name had a curious twist. In French, bis means two or twice, and cornet means horn. The two-horned one, thus they became known as the Devil's Door. The ghosts of both these craftsmen are said to haunt Notre Dame. Different phantoms are said to haunt Notre Dame, many of them connected to the suicides that were committed by humans who decided to end their lives inside this holy place. On August 31st, 1845, Baron Achille de Maynard, a 25-year-old aristocrat and poet, threw himself from the top of one of the towers. He was rich and a newlywed, having just married the daughter of the Count de Espagnac only 2 weeks before. The reason for self-destruction remained a mystery. One of the most mysterious effigies that adorns the cathedral is Listirge, which was added during the 19th century restoration. It is not a true gargoyle, since it's not used to drain water. It's known as a chimera, and was designed based on the creatures found in medieval bestiaries. A ghost seen wandering in the tower and around the gargoyles is tied to the suicide of a young unknown woman with the initials MJ. After plunging 60 meters, she fell on the railings below, and her body was severed in two. The event, which transpired on October 5th, 1882, was reported thus, quote, "The suicide reported yesterday of a young lady who threw herself off the upper exterior gallery of the Notre-Dame caused, it is stated, immense sensation in the quarter of Paris. The young lady, who is described as elegantly dressed and about 20 years of age, showed great determination and sang-froid in the accomplishment of her design. At 9 o'clock in the morning she requested to be allowed to visit the tower, but was refused, as no lady is permitted to make the ascent alone. Though disappointed, she did not give up her fatal project, but wandering about the cathedral succeeded in scraping acquaintance with an elderly woman who she invited to the tower. It was at 2 o'clock that they presented themselves at the foot of the stairs and were permitted to ascend. When they reached the upper gallery, it was raining in torrents. The old woman ran to take shelter in the bell ringer's room, which, however, she had scarcely reached before her young companion had, with a piercing cry, precipitated herself from a height of 60 meters into the streets below. She fell on the railings and was literally cut in two. Her identity has not yet been established. She was now suffering from want, as 5 francs were found in her purse. Her linen is marked with the initials MJ. The old woman who had consented to accompany her is said to have disappeared." End quote. In February 1931, another woman chose Notre Dame as the place to end her life. Her name was Antoinette Blair, a Mexican socialite who, previous to her marriage to an Englishman, was known as Antonieta Rivas Mercado. She was found with a bullet wound in her chest on a bench in front of the sacristy. The cathedral was reconsecrated, and the doors were closed during the 3-hour ceremony. Even though the newspapers reported that it was a pending divorce from her husband, which drove her to suicide, it appears that it was a failed romance with a Mexican politician, Jose Vasconcelos, who was already married and had a string of mistresses. She had been involved with him since 1929, and prior to that had fallen in love with the painter Manuel Rodriguez Lozano, a friend which did not feel the same about her. The supposed reason for her suicide was based on divorce papers being found in her purse, even though she had been trying to secure a divorce since 1927 to a man she had married when she was 19 years of age. He had refused to grant her a divorce until then, and she left behind a young son. She was buried in Cimetière de Tiassis, and then her remains were removed to the Osarium in 1936. Antoinette was not a lucky woman. especially in romance. Perhaps this is why she's believed to be one of the ghosts seen in the cathedral. Several of the newspapers of the time described her death in the following manner, quote, wealth, social prestige, and leadership in her nation's civic activities meant nothing to Mrs. Antoinette Blair if she had to live apart from her English husband, Albert Blair, Mexico City real estate dealer. Therefore, rather than go through pending divorce proceedings, she yesterday went to a bench inside a confessional in front of the sacristy of Notre-Dame Cathedral and shot herself in the chest. Mrs. Blair was 31 years old and the daughter of Antonio Rivas Mercado, one of the leading Mexican architects of his time. End quote. Lest you believe that the desire to exit this mortal coil in the most dramatic of fashion was done only in years past, this turns out this is not the case. On May 22, 2013, 1,500 visitors who were enjoying the beautiful cathedral were cleared out when a man put a letter on the altar, pulled out a gun, and shot himself in the head. If he decided to haunt Notre Dame, he is kept company by other shades, such as monks, bishops, and those who are unlucky in life and love. The only hope is that eventually these souls found peace walking through the shadowed corridors of this hallowed place. Following the fire in 2019, extensive restoration was carried out in Notre Dame. Roughly 100 graves were unearthed in the basement, with 80 excavated. In 2022, two body-shaped lead coffins were found buried under the nave. A brass plaque on one identified the remains as those of Antoine de la Porte, a priest who died in 1710. He died in his 80s, and according to examination of his bones, he led a sedentary life and had extraordinarily good teeth. He appeared to be healthy even for his advanced age, and only seemed to have suffered from gout. The second coffin had no plaque, and is believed to date to the 14th century. The man inside died in his 30s, and based on the condition of his deformed hips, it appears he was a horseman. Thus he was dubbed Le Cavalier. His teeth were destroyed by chronic disease, and his skull was deformed, possibly from wearing a headdress or a headband as an infant. He had signs of bone tuberculosis and meningitis. He was embalmed and buried wearing a crown of flowers. The waist skull had been sawn off, and his chest opened to be embalmed was apparently a common practice in the burial of nobility. Using these findings, researchers believe his name is Joaquin du Bellay. Born in 1522 and died in 1560, he was wealthy and the nephew of the French Cardinal Jean du Bellay. He lived in the cloister of Notre Dame, which is perhaps the reason why he was buried in the chapel of Saint Crepin and Crepinian, now Saint George, comprising the chapels of Saint Jacques, Saints Crepin and Saint Crepinien, Saint Etienne of Notre Dame. He was known to be fond of horses and mentioned the disease he suffered from in some of his poems. However, his identity is not totally confirmed. According to isotopic examination of the skeleton, it belonged to a man who lived in Paris, and Du Bellay was raised in Anjou. According to records, he was buried in a side chapel. However, it's possible he was moved afterward, or perhaps what was meant as a temporary burial place became permanent. After 6 years of restore, Notre Dame was reopened in December 2024. And you ask yourself, do these people, they commit suicide at the church hoping for forgiveness? Because if they're Catholic, it's considered a mortal sin? Or is it like, maybe they're unhappy with God and this is like thumbing their nose, like, here you go. I know I'm not supposed to do this, but I don't care. I want to do it anyway. Who knows, right? All right. Next story. This is out of the Jerusalem Post, and it's titled Excavation Near Jerusalem Finds 9,000-Year-Old Six-Fingered Neolithic Shaman Woman. The woman had 6 fingers on her left hand, a characteristic that in ancient cultures was often interpreted as a sign of distinction and spiritual authority. A recent study published in the journal Atiquot described a tomb found at the Matzah archaeological site in the hills of Jerusalem dating back to the pre-pottery Neolithic B period. The excavations at Matzah, conducted between 2018 and 2020 uncovered one of the largest concentrations of settlements from this period in the area. The research was carried out before the construction of Highway 16, the third access road to Jerusalem from the west. The tomb contained the remains of a woman who may have played a spiritual role or acted as a shaman in her community. Anatomical analysis indicates that the woman was over 15 years old at the time of her death. Notably, she had 6 fingers on her left hand, a characteristic that in ancient cultures was often interpreted as a sign of distinction and spiritual authority. Funerary objects found alongside the woman, including green stone necklaces and mother of pearl jewelry, reinforced the hypothesis of her importance within Neolithic society. Most individuals were buried with decorations such as stone bracelets, pendants, and beads made from exotic materials like alabaster and green stones. According to researchers, the stone bracelets found in some graves are associated with transitional rituals between life and death. The discovery of the ancient shaman's tomb in Matza opens a window into the spiritual world of communities that lived approximately 10,000 years ago. These remains show how complex and rich the cultural beliefs of ancient humanity were. Researchers suggest that children wore these stone bracelets until adolescence. Upon reaching a certain age, they participated in an initiation ceremony similar to modern transition rituals like bar and bat mitzvahs in Jewish tradition. Those who died before reaching maturity were buried with their bracelets, which had been found intact on their arms. Numerous burials were discovered within the houses, under the floors, and near the walls of the dwellings. Researchers and scholars suggest that rituals were conducted in large public buildings designated for this purpose, which may have included shamanic practices. Many of these public buildings had a strong connection to water, which may have played a role in the rituals conducted there. In each of the excavated buildings, plastered installations for water collection were found, or they were located near natural water sources, emphasizing the connection between water and ritual practices in Neolithic communities. These findings reinforced the perception that water played a crucial role in the religious ceremonies and social organization of the Neolithic groups. The Neolithic period marked a turning point in human history. New technologies were developed during this time, including the domestication of plants and animals. These innovations transformed not only the economy but also defined the belief systems and rituals of Neolithic communities. Through personal objects such as jewelry and ritual artifacts, we can learn about the belief systems, social classes, and community roles of the time. Now, I think what's interesting about this, a lot of times people think, and I know certain ancient cultures did it, like if a child or a baby was born with any type of deformity, they were exposed and left to die. But look, in this case, uh, this girl or this woman had an extra finger on her left hand, and obviously she was still kept within her community. And they're kind of fuzzy here, but it makes you think. It doesn't say she was, it indicates that she was over 15 years old at the time of her death. But it makes you think that she wasn't that much older. All right? She wasn't that much older when she died. So she died as a teenager, but there's no other information like that indicates what cause of death could have been, especially if she was that young. But I think it's very interesting when you see that even in all these Neolithic time periods, that that members of like even now that they've discovered that they used to care for their dead, the way that they would bury them, and that even when they had a child that was born with some type of deformity, it wasn't it wasn't abandoned, which I think is very interesting. So here we are. We've come to another end of some eerie news, but I will be back soon, never fear, with some weird stuff to talk about. Till next time.